Welcome to the Saving History podcast, the sanctuary for castle devotees and medieval history enthusiasts. Prepare to embark on a thrilling voyage through time as we unveil enthralling history and legend. From ancient folklore to cutting-edge restoration, we've got it all covered. So grab your headphones and let's dive right in.
Picture, if you will, a misty morning on the northeast coast of England. The year is 793, and the monks of Lindisfarne are going about their daily routines, unaware that their lives, and indeed the course of European history, are about to change forever. As the sun breaks through the fog, an ominous sight appears on the horizon. Sleek, dragon-prowed ships cutting through the waves with deadly purpose. The Viking Age has begun. The raid on Lindisfarne, a holy island off the Northumbrian coast, would become infamous as the event that marked the start of the Viking Age. But who were these fearsome warriors from the north, and what drove them to leave their Scandinavian homelands in search of riches and glory? To understand the Vikings, we must first dispel the notion that they suddenly appeared out of nowhere. The Norse people had been developing their unique culture and maritime skills for centuries before they burst onto the world stage. In the fjords and forests of Norway, the plains of Denmark and the rugged coasts of Sweden, a society had formed that prized strength, honour, and adventure. The Norse were expert shipbuilders and navigators, skills honed by necessity in their challenging northern environment. Their long ships, with their shallow draughts and both sail and oar propulsion, were technological marvels of their time. These vessels allowed the Vikings to navigate both open seas and inland waterways with unparalleled speed and maneuverability. But why did the Vikings choose this particular moment in history to expand beyond their borders? The answer lies in a perfect storm of factors that converged in the late 8th century. Climate change played a crucial role. A period of warmer temperatures had led to population growth in Scandinavia, putting pressure on limited arable land. At the same time, political consolidation was occurring, with powerful chieftains and nascent kings pushing out lesser nobles and freemen. These dispossessed Norsemen, armed with their superior ships and a warrior culture that glorified battle and exploration, looked outward for opportunities, and what they saw was a Europe ripe for the taking. The Carolingian Empire, though powerful, was focused on its southern borders. The British Isles were divided into small, often warring kingdoms. Both regions were wealthy, with poorly defended monasteries and towns full of treasure. The raid on Lindisfarne was not the first instance of Norse exploration, or even raiding in the British Isles, but it was the most dramatic and consequential to date. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the event with palpable dread. In this year, fierce, foreboding omens came over the land of the Northumbrians, and the wretched people shook. There were excessive whirlwinds, lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky. These signs were followed by great famine, and a little after those, that same year, on 6th Ides of January, the ravaging of wretched heathen people destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne. The attack sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. Here was an enemy unlike any they had faced before, pagan warriors who seemed to appear out of nowhere, struck with terrifying speed and violence, and disappeared back to the sea with their plunder before a defence could be mounted. But the Vikings were more than mere raiders. They were explorers, traders, settlers, and state-builders. In the years following Lindisfarne, Norse expeditions would push further and further afield. They established trading posts in Ireland, conquered large swaths of England, founded Dublin, and even sailed as far as North America. The popular image of the Viking as a horn-helmeted barbarian, a 19th century invention, by the way, belies the complexity of Norse society and the profound impact they would have on European history. These were not mindless brutes, but skilled warriors, canny politicians, and intrepid explorers who would leave an indelible mark on the lands they touched. As we stand on the shores of Lindisfarne in 793, watching the dragon ships disappear over the horizon with their bloodied treasure, we are witnessing the birth of a new era. The Viking Age would last for nearly 3 centuries, reshaping the political, cultural, and economic landscape of Europe and beyond. From these humble, if violent beginnings, a saga of exploration, conquest, and cultural exchange was about to unfold that would change the face of medieval Europe forever. The raid on Lindisfarne would become infamous as the event that marked the start of an era, but who were these fearsome warriors from the north? To understand the Vikings, we must look back to the fjords and forests of Norway, the plains of Denmark, and the rugged coasts of Sweden. There, a society had formed that prized strength, honour, and adventure above all else. For centuries, the Norse had been honing their shipbuilding and navigation skills, driven by the harsh necessities of their northern environment. Their longships, with shallow draughts and both sail and oar propulsion, were marvels of engineering that allowed them to navigate open seas and inland waterways with unparalleled speed and manoeuvrability. As the Vikings struck Lindisfarne, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the event with palpable dread. The attack sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. Here was an enemy unlike any they had faced before. Pagan warriors who seemed to appear out of nowhere, struck with terrifying speed and violence and disappeared back to the sea with their plunder before a defence could be mounted. As the dragon ships faded into the horizon, their holds heavy with Lindisfarne's treasures, none could have predicted the profound impact these Norse raiders would have on the course of European history. The success of the Lindisfarne raid spread like wildfire through the Norselands. Tales of the riches to be found across the sea ignited the imaginations of warriors and traders alike. As the 9th century dawned, the trickle of Viking expeditions was about to become a flood. In 795, the peaceful monastery of Iona, off the west coast of Scotland, fell victim to Viking raiders. The pattern was set. The Norse would target isolated, wealthy religious communities that offered rich pickings and little resistance. But the Vikings were not content with mere raiding. They were explorers at heart, and their longships carried them ever further into uncharted waters. In 802, a fleet of Norse ships appeared off the coast of Frisia, in modern-day Netherlands. The Frankish Emperor Charlemagne, who had spent decades subduing the Saxons to his east, now faced a new threat from the north. Despite his military prowess, even Charlemagne struggled to defend against the lightning-fast Viking raids. As the century progressed, the scale and ambition of Viking expeditions grew. In 839, a group of Rus, Swedish Vikings who had settled in Eastern Europe, arrived at the court of Emperor Theophilos in Constantinople. They had travelled down the great rivers of Russia, braving rapids and portages, to reach the fabled City of Gold. Their arrival marked the beginning of a new trade route that would connect the Baltic to the Black Sea and beyond. But it was in the British Isles that the Vikings would leave their most indelible mark during this period. In 865, a great army of Vikings landed in East Anglia. Unlike previous raiding parties, this was a force intent on conquest. Led by the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan and Ubba, the great heathen army, as it came to be known, swept through the kingdoms of Northumbria and Mercia. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, long divided, found themselves facing an existential threat. One by one they fell to the Viking onslaught. Northumbria's capital of York was captured in 866, becoming a Viking stronghold that would endure for generations. Mercia buckled under the Norse pressure, and East Anglia's King Edmund met a martyr's death, tied to a tree and shot full of arrows when he refused to renounce his Christian faith. Only the kingdom of Wessex, under the leadership of the young King Alfred, managed to stem the tide. In 878, Alfred's forces met the Vikings at the Battle of Edington. Against all odds, the West Saxons emerged victorious. The Treaty of Wedmore that followed divided England. The Vikings would rule the north and east, an area that became known as the Danelaw, while Alfred's Wessex controlled the south and west. As the 9th century drew to a close, the Vikings had transformed from mere raiders into settlers and kingdom builders. In Ireland, Norse settlers founded the city of Dublin, which would become a major hub of trade and culture. In the north of Britain, the Vikings established the Kingdom of York and settled in the northern and western Isles of Scotland. But the Norse hunger for exploration was far from sated. Even as they consolidated their gains in the British Isles and France, some Vikings looked to the west, where rumours spoke of new lands waiting to be discovered. In 874, the first Norse settlers arrived in Iceland, led by Ingolf Arnarsson. This windswept island would become a crucible for Norse culture, preserving the old ways and sagas even as Scandinavia itself began to change. As the sun set on the 9th century, the Viking Age was in full swing. The Norse had evolved from coastal raiders to empire builders, their influence stretching from the shores of North America to the steppes of Russia. But their greatest adventures and challenges still lay ahead. The tide of Viking expansion was rising, and it would reshape the map of Europe in ways that would endure for centuries to come. As the 10th century dawned, the Vikings stood at the threshold of their greatest period of expansion. The Norse warriors, who had once been content with raiding, now set their sights on conquest and colonization. The dragon ships that had once brought terror would now carry settlers, traders, and explorers to distant shores. In England, the Danelaw had become a thriving Norse kingdom, but the ambitions of the Vikings were far from satisfied. In 911, a band of Norse warriors led by Rollo besieged Paris. The Frankish king, Charles the Simple, unable to dislodge them, made a fateful decision. He granted Rollo and his men the land that would become Normandy, in exchange for their protection against other Viking raiders. Little did Charles know that he was sowing the seeds of a dynasty that would one day conquer England itself. Meanwhile, in the east, the Rus Vikings, who had first appeared in Constantinople decades earlier, were carving out a vast trading empire. Led by the legendary Rurik and his descendants, they founded the Kievan Rus, a state that would become the precursor to Russia and Ukraine. From their capital in Kiev, they traded furs, slaves, and amber for silks and silver from the Islamic world and Byzantium. But it was in the North Atlantic that the Vikings would truly come into their own as explorers. Iceland, settled in the previous century, had become a Norse commonwealth, a unique experiment in governance. From this wind-swept island, Vikings would launch even more ambitious voyages. In 982, a fiery-tempered Norwegian named Eric the Red was exiled from Iceland for manslaughter. Undaunted, he sailed west and discovered a vast, ice-covered land. With a showman's flair, he named it Greenland and returned to Iceland with tales of fertile valleys and rich hunting grounds. His salesmanship paid off, and in 985 he led a fleet of 25 ships to establish the first European settlement in Greenland. Eric's son, Leif Erikson, would go even further. Around the year 1000, Leif set sail from Greenland and landed on the shores of North America, some 500 years before Columbus. He called the land Vinland for the wild grapes he found growing there. Though the Norse settlements in North America would be short-lived, the Vikings had achieved a feat of exploration unmatched in their time. As the first millennium drew to a close, the Vikings had reshaped the map of Europe and beyond. Their longships had sailed from the shores of North America to the markets of Baghdad. They had founded kingdoms in England, Ireland, and France, and their influence stretched from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean. But as the year 1000 approached, changes were on the horizon. The wild, pagan warriors who had burst onto the world stage 2 centuries earlier were about to enter their golden age, one that would see them transform from outsiders to major players on the European stage. The turn of the millennium marked the beginning of the Viking Age's zenith. The Norse, once viewed as mere barbarians by their European neighbours, were now poised to take centre stage in the political drama of medieval Europe. This was the era when Viking leaders would wear crowns, wield diplomacy as skillfully as their axes, and leave an indelible mark on European history. In Scandinavia, the process of state formation that had begun in the previous century accelerated. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden emerged as unified kingdoms, their rulers no longer content with the title of Jarl or Chief, but claiming the mantle of King. This consolidation of power would have far-reaching consequences, both at home and abroad. The most dramatic example of Viking ambition in this period was Canute the Great. Son of Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, Canute invaded England in 1013. By 1016, he had outmanoeuvred his rivals and claimed the English throne. Not content with one crown, Canute went on to conquer Norway in 1028 and received the submission of parts of Sweden. At its height, Canute's North Sea Empire stretched from the shores of Ireland to the Baltic, making him one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. Canute's reign marked a turning point for the Vikings. No longer outsiders, they were now part of the European political mainstream. Canute ruled his empire not just through force of arms, but through canny diplomacy and administration. He minted coins, issued laws, and patronized the church, presenting himself as a Christian king in the mold of Charlemagne. This period also saw the Vikings complete their transformation from pagans to Christians. The process had been long and often bloody, but by the 11th century the old Norse gods were giving way to the Christian cross. In 1000, Iceland's Althing, Parliament, voted to adopt Christianity, while Norway's king Olaf Haraldsson imposed the new faith with sword and law. This religious shift would have profound implications for Norse culture and their relationships with their European neighbours. Yet even as the Vikings entered the mainstream of European culture, they didn't entirely abandon their old ways. In 1013, Sigtryg Silkbeard, the Viking king of Dublin, sponsored the last great Norse poem to be composed in Ireland, preface to the Passion of Christ. This blending of Norse and Celtic Christian traditions was emblematic of the Vikings' ability to adapt and absorb elements of the cultures they encountered. The Vikings' skill as traders and explorers continued to serve them well. The Varangian Guard, an elite unit of the Byzantine Emperor's bodyguard, was composed largely of Scandinavians who had made their way to Constantinople. These warriors, who had once raided the coasts of Europe, now stood as the last line of defence for the most powerful Christian ruler in the world. In the west, Norse exploration continued. Around 1010, Thorfinn Karlsefni led a major expedition to Vinland, attempting to establish a permanent settlement in North America. Though ultimately unsuccessful, it marked the high watermark of Viking exploration. As the middle of the 11th century approached, the Viking Age was reaching its twilight. The Norse had transformed from raiders to rulers, from pagans to Christians, from outsiders to kingmakers. But one last drama remained to be played out, a final Viking bid for power that would change the course of English and European history forever. In 1066, Harold Godwinson sat upon the English throne, but his rule was contested by two other claimants, Harold Hardrada, the King of Norway, and William, Duke of Normandy, himself a descendant of Viking settlers. As these three men prepared to fight for the crown of England, the stage was set for the last act of the Viking Age, a climactic struggle that would mark the end of an era and the beginning of a new chapter in European history. The year 1066 dawned, with an air of foreboding in England. King Edward the Confessor had died childless, leaving the succession in doubt. As spring turned to summer, three men prepared to stake their claim to the English throne, each embodying a different aspect of the complex tapestry that European politics have become in the wake of the Viking Age. Harold Godwinson, the elected King of England, represented the Anglo-Saxon nobility that had ruled England for centuries. Yet even he bore the mark of Norse influence, his mother having been Danish. To the north, Harald Hardrada, the king of Norway, prepared to invade, carrying the banner of the old Viking warriors who had so often sought glory and riches in England. And across the Channel, William, Duke of Normandy, descendant of the Viking Rollo, rallied his forces, blending Norse ferocity with French chivalry. The stage was set for a climactic struggle that would mark the end of the Viking Age. In September, Harald Hardrada struck first, landing in Yorkshire with a formidable force. Harold Godwinson raced north to meet him, and at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the last great Viking army to invade England was crushed. Harald Hardrada fell in battle, and with him died the dream of a resurgent Norse empire. But even as Harold celebrated his victory, word reached him that William of Normandy had landed in the south. Exhausted from their march north, Harold's forces now had to race back to face this new threat. On October 14, 1066, the Anglo-Saxon and Norman armies clashed at the Battle of Hastings. As the day wore on, a chance arrow found its mark, striking Harold in the eye. With their king fallen, the Anglo-Saxon lines broke and William emerged victorious. The Norman Conquest marked a turning point in European history. Though William was himself of Viking stock, his victory signalled the end of the Viking Age in England. The Norse influence, which had shaped English politics and culture for generations, would now be subsumed into the new Norman order. In the aftermath of 1066, the Viking world continued to change. In 1069, the last Viking raid on England was beaten back. The great Norse kingdoms of Dublin and York, which had once dominated the Irish Sea region, crumbled in the face of resurgent Irish and Anglo-Norman power. In Scandinavia itself, the old ways were giving way to new ideas and institutions. The Christianization of the North, which had begun in earlier centuries, was now complete. The great pagan temple at Uppsala in Sweden was destroyed, replaced by a Christian church. The Norse gods, once honoured in great halls and sacred groves, retreated into folklore and legend. Yet even as the old religion faded, it left an indelible mark on the culture of northern Europe, its stories and symbols woven into the fabric of the emerging Christian kingdoms. As the 11th century drew to a close, the era of Viking raids and conquests was over. The Norse had transformed from outsiders into integral parts of the European political and cultural landscape. Their longships no longer inspired terror on the coasts of Europe, but their legacy lived on in the nations they had helped to shape, the trade routes they had established, and the stories they left behind. The twilight of the Viking Age had come, but the impact of these Norse adventurers, warriors, and settlers would continue to resonate through the centuries to come. As the last echoes of the Viking Age faded, the Norse influence remained deeply ingrained in the fabric of European society. The longships may have been beached, the raids may have ceased, but the legacy of the Vikings continued to shape the world in profound and often surprising ways. In England, the Norman aristocracy that now ruled the land carried the blood of Viking ancestors in their veins. The French they spoke was infused with Norse words, and the feudal system they imposed bore the imprint of Scandinavian social structures. English itself, once merely influenced by Norse, now incorporated thousands of words of Scandinavian origin. Common terms like sky, leg, egg, law, and husband all trace their roots back to the language of the Vikings. The impact of the Norse was not limited to language. Their legal traditions, with concepts of individual rights and representative assemblies, left a lasting mark on English common law. The Danelaw, that region of England once under Viking rule, retained distinctive legal customs for centuries. Even today, place names across Britain and Ireland bear witness to Norse settlement, from Derby and Whitby in England to Wicklow and Waterford in Ireland. In France, the Normans, those descendants of Viking settlers, had become a major power. Their influence extended far beyond Normandy, as Norman adventurers carved out kingdoms in southern Italy and Sicily. In 1099 it was a Norman, Tancred, who was among the first crusaders to enter Jerusalem. The Viking spirit of adventure and conquest lived on in these Norman expeditions. To the east, the legacy of the Rusi's Vikings had given birth to a new power. The Kievan Rusi's state they had founded evolved into Russia and Ukraine. The very name, Russia, is derived from Ruses, a term linked to the Swedish Vikings who had first navigated the great rivers of Eastern Europe. The early Russian rulers, including the famed Vladimir the Great, traced their lineage back to the Viking chieftain Rurik. In the North Atlantic, the Norse colonies left a complex legacy. Greenland, settled by Eric the Red, maintained its Norse population for nearly 500 years before succumbing to changing climate and economic conditions. Iceland, however, flourished. This Viking Commonwealth became a unique experiment in medieval governance, preserving ancient Norse traditions even as it adapted to the Christian world. The Icelandic sagas, written down in the 13th and 14th centuries, preserve the stories and ethos of the Viking Age, providing us with invaluable insights into Norse culture and history. The Vikings' impact on maritime technology and exploration cannot be overstated. Their longships, with their innovative, clinker-built hulls and flexible construction, influenced shipbuilding for generations. The Norse mastery of navigation, using the sunstone to locate the sun on cloudy days, foreshadowed later developments in seafaring technology. Their voyages to North America, centuries before Columbus, stand as a testament to their exploratory spirit and skill. In the realm of art and culture, the Viking aesthetic left an indelible mark. Intricate animal styles and complex knotwork of Norse art influenced design across Europe. The Norse myths and legends, with their tales of gods and heroes, permeated European folklore and continue to capture imaginations to this day. From Wagner's operas to Marvel's Thor, the gods of Asgard have found new life in modern popular culture. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the Viking Age was the transformation of Scandinavia itself. The Norse homeland emerged from this period as a cluster of powerful, centralized kingdoms. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden became players on the European stage, their histories inextricably linked with those of their southern neighbors. The Baltic became a Norse lake, with Swedish influence extending deep into what is now Finland and the Baltic states. As we look back across the centuries, the Viking Age stands as a pivotal period in European history. It was a time of violence and upheaval, yes, but also a time of cultural exchange, technological innovation, and state formation. The Vikings, those fierce warriors from the north, helped shape the Europe we know today. Their legacy lives on in our languages, our laws, our art, and our imagination. The longships have long since rotted away, the great halls have crumbled to dust, but the spirit of the Vikings, that restless desire to explore, to seek new horizons, to leave a mark on the world, continues to resonate. In the end, perhaps, that is their greatest legacy, a reminder that from the meeting of cultures, however turbulent, can come lasting change and rich new tradition. As we close the saga of the Viking Age, we are reminded that history is not merely a recounting of past events, but a living force that continues to shape our world. The Norse adventurers who set sail from the shores of Scandinavia over 1,000 years ago could scarcely have imagined the enduring impact the voyages would have. Yet here we are, still telling their stories, still grappling with their legacy, still inspired by their daring. The Viking Age may have ended, but its echoes continue to resound through the halls of history. Thank you for joining us on this enchanting journey through medieval history. While our weekly episodes will continue to captivate your imagination, there's an exclusive treasure trove for subscribers, a secret vault of bonus episodes filled with extra tales and deep dives into the subjects we cover. Your curiosity fuels our mission, and we're truly thankful for your support. Until we meet again among stone walls and towering turrets, keep that torch of curiosity burning bright. Thank you for listening.